In a small town, safety isn't enforced so much as assumed. It comes from routine, familiar faces, predictable days, doors locked more out of habit than fear. You learn which risks can be ignored and which ones never seem to arrive at all. Strangers test that confidence. Most pass through without leaving much behind. But occasionally, someone comes in already knowing what they want and how little resistance they'll face getting it.
You're listening to tonight's Terror, original horror stories to hear in the dark. Subscribe and share if you're a fan. And now, tonight's story.
The man at the front of the room was struggling to keep his composure. The lights on the little stage were warm on his face. His cheeks were reddening, and his voice was rising in volume. I'll do my best to address everyone's questions after I've provided an overview of what's happening. The meeting hall was crowded. People filled the wooden benches and stood in aisles. Most wore expressions of agitation. Why can't you just do this in Salem? A voice called out from the shadows. The man on the stage pushed out his bottom jaw in exasperation. It's nearly impossible to get permits to do that, and our production couldn't afford it anyway. He waited like a school teacher for the murmurs to die down before continuing. We're excited to make our movie in your town. We chose Green Falls because it's beautiful and a historically significant place. This meeting hall in particular is a remarkable gem. It's historic. Some would even say sacred. We'll treat it with respect and reverence at every turn. Salem is those things too, but as you all probably know, that town is choked with tourists every weekend and holiday. Another anonymous shout, a man's voice, indignant and sharp. So our town gets choked with actors' crews and God knows what else? We have businesses to run. Ted shifted in his seat to see who had spoken. The speaker had a point. It wasn't a big town, and this would be a disruption, without question. However, the truth was that Green Falls depended on tourism. Not the mania that descended on Salem around Halloween, but a steady stream of wealthy couples looking to eat and shop in an idyllic New England town kept businesses afloat. The residents liked to complain about tourists, but the town would have sunk into oblivion decades ago without them. Just another fading mill town in rural Massachusetts. Before he could identify the speaker, the woman beside him stood. It was Mrs. Barnes. She ran a tea room and gift shop on Main Street near the falls. The community knew her well, and the room quieted instinctively. Her voice was small and refined. Do you imagine that your production team and actors will patronize our restaurants and stores? Ted smiled. It was just like Mrs. Barnes to try to find a pleasant middle ground. She had a reputation for kindness and charity. Her little restaurant probably gave out more free food than the rest of the businesses in town combined. Ted had watched her spot an underfed teenager a half block away and have a muffin ready by the time they passed her door. The man on stage, who had introduced himself as the film's executive producer, as if that meant anything to the locals, smiled and nodded politely as Mrs. Barnes spoke. His name was Roland Dunn. He was tall and thin. He wore understated black pants and a matching turtleneck. When he answered, his voice was steady. Well, I certainly intend to stop by each of your businesses in the coming weeks. Ted surprised himself by interjecting, I don't think that's what she asked. Mrs. Barnes took her seat again and patted Ted's hand softly. Roland shot Ted a fierce look, which he covered quickly with a smile. I don't think I can say whether the crew will patronize your restaurants. There will be a craft services trailer set up in the high school parking lot that will handle that. Sarcastic laughter simmered around the dimly lit hall. Ted wondered what anyone had intended to accomplish by coming here tonight, himself included. The town board had approved the permits months ago. This was a done deal. The producer was only here to provide information. The meeting had taken the tenor of a trial, with Roland Dunn on the stand. Ted decided it was best to learn all he could and get back to his shop. "What kind of disruptions can we anticipate to commerce while you're here?" Ted asked. Roland looked relieved to have the chance to get back on message. He laid out the dates the production would be using various parts of town. The meeting carried on without much more in the way of theatrics from the crowd. Eventually, Ted decided he'd learned all he was going to learn and rose to leave. The meeting hall was a repurposed church from the 18th century, one of the oldest in the country. Ted picked his way carefully through the crowd, recognizing familiar faces, most of them drawn and skeptical. Everyone here feared change, himself included. He paused by the glass display cases in the entryway to listen a moment longer. They were filled with carefully preserved artifacts from the building's former life as a colonial Protestant church. A large leather Bible secured with a delicate metal chain, a segment of a wooden pew, and, for reasons Ted didn't understand, a broken hourglass. People were fiercely protective of the old church, especially the Green Falls Historical Society and its chairwoman, Ellen Barnes. Behind him, separated from the room by red velvet ropes, stood the real treasure. The grand pulpit loomed in place, dark and ornately carved, nearly 10 feet high. Narrow wooden stairs wrapped around its side. The pulpit was angled toward the center of the room, as though it still expected a congregation below. From it, colonial preachers must have once looked down on their parishioners. Ted never liked the sense that it was still doing that. The pulpit had been moved from the head of the church when the building was repurposed as a meeting hall in the early 1900s, but it retained its authority. Ted didn't linger near it. He never had. As the door swung closed behind him, one final voice rose from the crowd inside. "And what exactly do you need this building for?" Ted was a sturdy man of nearly 6 feet. He wore a beard, but kept his hair trimmed short. His unofficial uniform, a dusty blue Carhartt jacket and brown Dickie pants, suited both his temperament and his work. The lights were on in Ted's shop when he unlocked the front door and flipped the orange and black closed sign to open. At the cost of a slightly higher electric bill, he left the lights on whenever the shop was closed. There wasn't much crime in Green Falls, but he didn't like the idea of taking chances. Ted's Tackle had been in business for 8 years. He was the sole employee and owner. The shop stayed busy, with the Green River just steps away. In the warmer months, fly fishermen dotted the shoreline for 30 miles in each direction. The village had become an unofficial hub for serious bass fishermen. Business was good. Shortly after opening, he expanded into fishing charters. Now those excursions represented the majority of the shop's revenue. As he pored over the month's invoices behind the counter, Ted thought again of the offer he'd received. A wealthy customer from the city had offered to invest so that Ted could expand. There was another town 20 miles away that would support a second location, the man had said. Ted had told him he'd think it over. Part of him knew he'd never do it. His operation was small, efficient, and stable. The risk always seemed to overmaster whatever wealth or comfort expansion might bring. Through the wide front windows of the shop, Ted saw Mrs. Barnes pass arm in arm with Dave Reynolds. They were locked in a lively conversation, debriefing the Chamber of Commerce meeting, no doubt. Dave owned the Green Falls pub beside her place. His restaurant was the crown jewel of Green Falls Commercial District. Even if district was a somewhat elegant term for a half-mile-long main street of 24 businesses. The Green Falls pub was perched on the edge of a drop-off that fell to the river below. The falls stretched across the view from Dave's dining room. People ate there for the view, but came back for the legendary popovers and flank steak sandwiches. Dave even lit the falls with colored floodlights on special occasions. Ted had met Dave years earlier at the bar, back when Ted still came in during the afternoons. More than once, Dave had slid a glass of water over the counter instead of another beer and said nothing about it. When Ted finally kicked the drinking and stopped coming in at all, Dave never asked why. He did show up in the shop a week later with a ledger and a lifetime of business advice. They'd remained friends since. The microwave in the shop's office beeped, and Ted pulled out his dinner. He preferred to find reasons to eat dinner in the shop. There was something about sitting alone at the dining room table at home that felt hopeless. Reheated pasta and vegetables over a ledger on the shop counter at least gave him an excuse. When Ted stepped outside into the gloom of the evening, he surveyed Main Street. It was quiet, save for the shush and rumble of the falls beyond Dave's pub. He wondered if the movie would end up bringing money to town. Think of the devil, Ted mused, as a pristine vintage Cadillac rolled by. Behind the wheel was the film producer, Roland Dunn. The appeasing, politicking version of him Ted had seen in the meeting was gone. The man's face was devoid of emotion. His cheeks hung loosely. His eyelids drooped half shut as he gazed dumbly ahead through the windshield. Ted watched from the stoop of his shop as the car slid quietly down the street and out of sight. 5 days after the town meeting, Ted was spooling a reel behind the counter when the bell over the door rang. A man he recognized but didn't know by name came in and paused to stamp the cold from his boots. He wore a quilted vest and a knit cap pulled low, his cheeks still pink from the weather. "They're really going to bring Hollywood here, huh?" the man said. He wandered toward the wall of lures, running a finger along the fluorescent-colored pieces without picking any up. "That's what it sounds like," Ted said. He kept his eyes on the reel, feeding the line through his fingers. "You hear what it's about?" Ted shook his head. "No." The man leaned closer to the counter, lowering his voice. "Witches," he said. "Period piece. The producer, Dunn, stayed behind after you left. He told everyone about it. Didn't go over especially well, from what I heard." Ted clipped the line and tested the reel with a short turn of the handle. It spun smoothly. "A movie's a movie," he said. "They all dress it up somehow." The man studied him. "You don't mind?" "As long as they pay their bills and clean up after themselves." The man laughed once. "I guess that's one way to look at it." They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the river could be heard faintly through the closed door. The man selected a small tin of spinners and brought it to the counter. After paying, he lingered near the door, his hand resting on the handle. "Just don't like the idea of that sort of thing being what we're known for," he said. "They'll film it, people will visit, and then it'll be over," Ted said. The man nodded, unconvinced, and then stepped back into the cold. After the bell went quiet, Ted finished with the reel and set it aside. He turned to the calendar, tacked up beside the register, and flipped the page. He scanned the dates until he found the one he wanted and marked it with an X. Shooting begins, he thought. 10 days. Ted first noticed the strangers on Main Street the morning the delivery truck arrived late. They stood out, not because they were loud or hurried, but because they were dressed well. The men wore suspenders over plain shirts, their sleeves rolled with too much intention. The women favored long skirts and boots that looked broken in despite appearing new. It wasn't a costume exactly, more like an idea of country clothes filtered through a contemporary lens. Ted thought of old-fashioned TV shows he'd seen as a kid, prairie families rendered clean and earnest, the edges softened for modern sensibilities. Film people, he decided. Wardrobe, maybe. Or extras getting an early start. Ted didn't really know how movie productions worked. He assumed they arrived in pieces. People first, equipment later, until everything eventually added up to something recognizable. They moved in little clusters, pausing too long at storefront windows, speaking quietly among themselves. A few drifted toward the falls, others lingered near the green. He was locking up the shop briefly to run an errand when The door to Mrs. Barnes' tea room swung open. One of the strangers stepped out. A young man, clean-shaven, wearing a vest buttoned high at the throat. He paused on the sidewalk, stretched his arms once as if loosening up, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It looked satisfied, as though he'd achieved a task. Then he turned and headed down the street without looking back. Ted crossed to the tea room window. Inside, Mrs. Barnes was bent over the counter, both hands braced against the wood. Her shoulders were drawn tight. Even from the sidewalk, Ted could see her shaking. She lifted one hand to her face, wiped at her eyes, and leaned forward again, her head bowed. Ted reached for the door. That was when the sound hit. Metal on metal, sharp, followed by the hollow crunch of a bumper giving way. He turned to see two cars tangled awkwardly in the middle of the street. A sedan had clipped the back end of the delivery van. Both vehicles stopped at a crooked angle. One of the oddly dressed strangers stood between them, already stepping away from the scene. "You can't just walk away like that," one of the drivers shouted. The stranger didn't even break stride. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. He strolled down Main Street as if the noise behind him belonged to a different place entirely. When Ted turned back to the tea room window, Mrs. Barnes was gone. The counter stood empty, the register closed, a cup of tea cooling beside the till. Ted stood there a moment longer, then stepped away from the glass. Up the street, someone laid on a horn. Ted didn't like the film people. It wasn't because they were in the entertainment business, or because they were outsiders. He just didn't feel comfortable near them. He got the impression others felt the same. He'd witnessed all sorts of strange moments around town over the past week, all involving the oddly dressed strangers. He'd seen one chased out of the bowling alley by a group of surly dads. Another had been shouting at the teenage clerk at the grocery store. Last night had been the breaking point. Ted was arranging ice fishing rigs in the front display window when a dog ran by. He knew most of the dogs in town, at least those that were walked on Main Street. He'd never seen this one before. It was tall, lean, and rough-looking. Dark, wild fur. He watched it only because it was unaccompanied and colorless. The sun was setting, and a cold wind was funneling down Main Street. Ted didn't hear what was coming next. He was nearly finished adjusting the tip-up rods when he saw them. More dogs. At least 10. And people among them. They were fast. They pounded down the middle of Main Street and wouldn't have stopped for traffic even if there had been any. They moved like a pack. Dogs in stride with men and women. They wore the same odd, dated garb that Ted was beginning to see as the unofficial uniform of the movie people. He squinted past the glare on the glass. It looked like they weren't wearing shoes. Their feet must have been in agony on the frozen pavement, he thought. As they tore past, Ted saw their faces, wide-eyed and feral, dogs and people alike. They charged ahead, as if drawn by some whistle Ted couldn't hear. He stepped to the door and leaned out to watch them disappear. They turned beyond the hardware store, where an alley emptied into the woods that bordered Main Street. He stood in the cold, shocked and confused, as snow began swirling in the growing dark. 10 minutes later, he had called Dave Reynolds and asked him to meet for dinner the next night. These people were starting to feel like invaders. He felt certain he'd soon be hearing about arrests or vandalism, but he knew himself. He sometimes went straight to worst-case thinking. He wanted to know whether Dave felt the same. They chose a restaurant on Route 8, just outside of town. Anything to avoid running into one of them. The place was a low building set back from the road, lit by a string of colored Christmas bulbs along the eaves. Inside it smelled of grease and wood smoke. They sat in a booth by the window, traffic sliding past in a steady ribbon of headlights. Dave loosened his tie and rolled his sleeves. He looked tired in a way Ted recognized. You picked this place on purpose? Dave asked, lifting his drink. Ted nodded. Figured it was far enough. Dave gave a thin smile. Can't argue with that. They ordered and ate for a while without speaking. Ted watched the road, cars appearing and vanishing, each one gone before the sound fully faded. You getting many of them in your place? Ted asked. Dave let out a short breath. More than I want. Anything in particular? They don't act right, Dave said, setting his fork down. That's the simplest way to put it. Ted waited. Couple of nights back, Dave said, lowering his voice. One of them sat at the bar for almost an hour without ordering anything, just stared at the chalkboard menu like he expected it to change. He had on a shirt made of this coarse wool, sweat stains up on the collar. When I asked what he wanted for the fourth time, he asked what people used to drink there. Not what I serve, what they used to drink. What did you tell him? Beer, Dave said. Same as anywhere. He shook his head. It didn't satisfy him. Ted looked down at his plate. Before he left, Dave said, he muttered something under his breath. Hemlock. Real quiet, like he was reminding himself. Hemlock? Ted asked. That's what he said. Stood up and walked out. You think it's the movie? Ted asked. I think it's something, Dave said, and I don't love it being here. Ted nodded. Me neither. Dave studied him. You're usually better at taking yourself out of things. I'm trying, Ted said. It's not a big town, and my place is on Main. Ted's eyes flicked to the front window of the restaurant and the red taillights slipping through the slush and rock salt. Dave followed his gaze. Kara's anniversary's coming up, huh? Ted nodded, but didn't take his eyes off the highway outside. It had been nearly 6 years since the accident. Ted and his wife, Kara, had been winding their way back from her parents' place. They lived an hour from Green Falls, in a small Berkshire town. It was dark on the road. The cone of light from the headlights did little to help as Ted strained to keep the car between the lines. Kara's father had asked them to stay one more night and avoid the snow. Kara had diplomatically declined. They had already spent one too many nights in her parents' guest room, and she wanted to get home. Ted was worried about the forecast too, but he didn't argue. The only detail he remembered clearly from their goodbye on her parents' stoop was Kara's mother's voice. They were words that still haunted him. Why not just stay? It's not worth it. Most of the moments leading up to the crash had vanished from Ted's mind. A doctor had told him this was common after traumatic events. The only thing he could recall was rounding a bend and seeing headlights in his lane, too bright to look at. When he replayed it now, he sometimes imagined he'd had the presence of mind to tell Kara he loved her, or at least reach for her hand. He was fairly certain he hadn't. Ted blinked and turned back to the restaurant's interior. The waitress passed their table without stopping, a pot of coffee in one hand. Outside, a truck hit a patch of slush and hissed as it slowed for the light. Dave didn't say anything. I should get back, Ted said after a moment. Early morning. Dave nodded. Yeah. They paid and stood. In the parking lot, the cold pressed in, immediately sharp and bracing. Dave clapped Ted on the shoulder once before heading back to his truck. The movie people? Dave began as he unlocked his truck door. They're probably harmless. Let's just keep our distance. Come to the pub Sunday. Watch the game. Ted gave an assenting nod. He waited behind the wheel of his car until Dave's headlights disappeared onto Route 8. He exhaled deeply and turned the key in the ignition. Ted drove home slowly, eyes steady on the road ahead. A string of Christmas lights was working on Ted's last nerve. 2 nights ago, he had watched a YouTube video on a channel for small business owners about making your storefront pop. Now he was teetering on the second highest step of his ladder, straining to hook the lights onto a nail in the shop's facade. It was just a few inches beyond his reach. He knew he should climb down and move the ladder a foot to the right, but something in him wanted to finish it quickly. Ted had begun thinking of his shop as a refuge from the chaos of Green Falls. The filming was happening in earnest now. One day, a side street might be roped off for 6 hours. The next, the park beside the falls was closed, and the road beside it jammed with trucks. It was simpler to stand behind the counter and avoid the strangers entirely. He lunged and whipped the braided green cord around the nail, nearly throwing himself off the ladder in the process. Ted gripped the ladder to steady himself, took a breath, and stepped carefully down. It wasn't like him to be so impatient or reckless. He didn't like thinking about it, but a part of him simply didn't like having his back turned to Main Street these days. The dog pack, the car accident, none of it felt normal or right. Ted was folding the ladder when a shout drew his attention. Up the street, just a few doors down, he saw Mrs. Barnes. Something was wrong. Her typically stooped posture was gone. She stood upright and uncharacteristically animated. Her finger jabbed into the chest of a young woman outside her shop. The girl wore a skirt and black boots. It surprised him to see the conflict wasn't with one of the oddly dressed movie extras. Mrs. Barnes was shouting something Ted couldn't understand. He had never seen her so upset. He leaned the ladder against the wall and started up the street. Mrs. Barnes' voice grew clearer, and Ted could scarcely believe what he was hearing. She was cursing and shrieking. Among the spray of expletives, Ted gathered that the patron, the young woman, had done something to provoke her. The sweet old woman Ted had known most of his adult life was wild with rage. She spat strange epithets he didn't recognize, words like jade and bedsworn and goat's bride. He was only steps from the tea shop door when the confrontation reached its climax. Some part of Ted knew what was coming before he saw it, but he was too slow to stop it. Mrs. Barnes reared back, her arms spread wide. Then her hand slashed forward and struck the young woman's face with a crack so sharp Ted flinched. The woman cried out and staggered back. As she retreated toward her car, more shocked than injured, she hurled threats at Mrs. Barnes, lawsuits, the police, the Better Business Bureau. Mrs. Barnes stood, unmoved, in the doorway of her tea shop, staring after her. Ted wasn't sure what to do. He had started up the street intending to help Mrs. Barnes, but now it seemed she was the one who had done the harm. "Ellen?" he said, uncertain. Mrs. Barnes turned to him. Her stony expression didn't soften. "Yes, Edward," she replied. Her voice was cold. Ted found nothing familiar in her face. She looked different, unwell. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "What was that about?" "That woman," Mrs. Barnes began contemptuously. "That light-skirted tramp had her phone out in my shop. I saw what she was looking at." She stared at Ted expectantly. When he didn't respond, she concluded, "Filth." Ted weighed his words and chose diplomacy. "There are lots of strange folks around these days. I expect they're tied up with this movie they're making." Mrs. Barnes didn't answer. Instead, she offered her arm, as she so often did, for Ted to help her inside. He was grateful for the familiar gesture. He took her arm and steadied her as she climbed the 2 steps to the door. He released her forearm once she was within reach of the knob, just as he always had. Her hand shot out and pinched the skin on the back of his hand. Ted gasped and looked down. The small mound of skin she held turned white under the pressure of her fingers. He looked up at her face. Her expression was twisted into a snarling grin. Before he could speak, she leaned close. "Now get home and hide in your bed," she said softly. Then, with all the venom her voice could summon, she added, "Wife killer." Ted was too shocked to speak. When she released his hand, he looked down and saw the small tent of flesh her pinch had left. Before he could collect himself, the old woman slipped inside and locked the door behind her. Ted stepped back onto the sidewalk and stared after her, until she disappeared into the kitchen beyond the counter. Lying awake in bed that night, Ted racked his memory, trying to uncover some clue that might explain why Mrs. Barnes had done what she did. He was confused and hurt by what she'd said to him, but the ugly, raving confrontation she'd had with the woman on the sidewalk replayed in his mind as well. He was certain he'd done nothing to Mrs. Barnes to provoke her. He had always treated her for what she was, a sweet old woman. Then he remembered the strange man he'd seen leaving Mrs. Barnes' shop the day he noticed her crying. He never had the chance to ask her about it. He certainly wouldn't seek her out now, but something told Ted the events were connected. He rolled over and sighed. It was one more reason to start counting the days until the movie people left town. Ted made it 2 days without encountering any of the oddly dressed movie people. He kept to his shop and drove home as soon as he closed. He didn't see any packs of dogs and people charging down the street. He was pleased. If he could just stick to a simple routine, one he could control, he felt he might be able to avoid the entire headache. He clenched his jaw each time he saw one of them pass his shop windows. Luckily, none seemed interested in fishing during their time in Green Falls. As he drove home late that afternoon, he noticed an enormous man. He was dressed in a black wool 3-piece suit and standing in front of the meeting hall. The man was stooping to hammer a wooden plaque to the picket fence that bordered the hall grounds. The fence, more ornamental than functional, buckled with each blow. Flecks of paint broke loose and fell to the sidewalk. Ted felt his face grow hot. "Who does this asshole think he is?" Ted said aloud. He checked his rear-view mirror and braked hard. The car jolted to a stop beside the man. Ted lowered his window and leaned across the passenger seat. He opened his mouth to shout, then stopped short. The man had to be nearly 7 feet tall, and Ted could see only his lower half through the window. His eyes went to the hammer. The man's huge hand tightened around the handle, and Ted thought he heard the wood squeak under the pressure. The man bent down. His head and chest filled the car window. Ted wilted. The need to chew the man out for vandalizing the fence evaporated. "What's the sign saying?" he stammered. The man said nothing. He stared at Ted for a long moment, then straightened and sauntered away down the sidewalk. Ted watched him go, silently scolding himself for voluntarily entering an interaction with one of those people. Then he read the sign. In crude black letters, the notice addressed the citizens of Green Falls. "Attention! This sacred place will be in use on Friday from dusk to dawn. Keep out." Ted chuckled at the bizarre language and the unprofessional look of the sign. Not exactly indicative of a professional film operation, he thought. He rolled the window up and drove slowly home. Nightmares tortured Ted that night. In a dream, he found himself standing in the middle of the bridge by the falls, looking down into the roaring water and mist. Suddenly he realized he wasn't alone. At the end of the bridge stood a pack of the movie people. They glared and sneered at him. Then he sensed they weren't looking at him, but at something behind him. He turned, and a woman, or what he took to be a woman, stood inches from his face. Her eyes were milky white. Her mouth hung open, revealing jagged teeth like broken gravestones. Ted was rooted to the spot. His legs wouldn't obey. The woman's hair was tangled with leaves and briars. He desperately wanted to move, but his feet stayed planted to the bridge. She drew a small stone bowl from within the brown cloak draped over his shoulders. Inside was a foul mixture. Ted thought he glimpsed shards of bone. In a flash, she swiped her fingers through the poultice and flicked it into his face. As the beads of liquid sprayed into his eyes and face, he woke. His heart pounded. The sheets were damp with sweat. When he finally managed to calm down, Ted glanced at the digital clock beside the bed. It was 9 a.m. He hadn't slept past 6 a.m. in 20 years. In the landscape of his life since his wife's death, Ted had clung to routine and caution with monkish dedication. The dream, paired with what felt like a betrayal by his body's normal rhythm, left him unsettled. 10 minutes later, Ted was dressed and ready for work. Still agitated, he skipped coffee and dashed out the door. As he drove through the village, Ted thought again of the enormous man with the hammer. The sign remained fixed to the meeting hall fence. He'd asked Dave about it, and neither of them knew of any official announcement from the town or the film people. It was Thursday, and Ted hoped that after they used the hall for their shoot on Friday, they'd leave town as promised over the weekend. He was pulled from these thoughts by movement, coming fast from the right. Before he could break, a woman, perhaps 40, leapt into the street. She wore a long, gray skirt that tangled around her legs as she moved. She stepped into the street and thrust her leg toward the car. Ted slammed the brakes, but too late. He watched in horror as her leg disappeared beneath the tire. He felt the bump. He heard a snap. Ted threw the car into park and scrambled out. There was no sound, no screaming. Was she dead? He rounded the hood and saw the woman lying back against the curb. Her spine arched unnaturally. Her leg was badly broken. Blood seeped through her long gray stockings. His stomach turned as she shifted, and a jagged piece of bone pierced the wool, shining wet and white. Ted finally looked at her face as he began babbling an apology, then stopped mid-sentence when he saw her expression. She was smiling. The sight jarred him. She looked pleased, almost amused. Ted told himself she must be in shock, but the image was grotesque, lying in the street, grinning, with a bone protruding from her leg. He stepped back without realizing it. Footsteps sounded behind him. Ted looked up the street to see two people emerge from a nearby house, jogging toward them. The woman on the pavement noticed them too. She looked back at Ted and raised one eyebrow, mischievous. Then she screamed. The sound tore out of her all at once. She howled and moaned as she writhed on the pavement. Ted wore a pained and perplexed expression but said nothing. The neighbors reached her side, murmuring reassurance. Ted returned to the driver's door, reached inside for his phone. The police officer, a man named Kevin, whom Ted had known for years, spoke to the injured woman while she was being loaded into the ambulance. Ted stood sheepishly behind his car waiting. When Kevin approached, Ted offered a thin smile and a nod. Kevin began. So, she says she's not necessarily going to press charges. Charges? Ted interrupted. Well, yes, Ted. She alleges you were looking at your cell phone when you hit her. What? I absolutely was not on my phone. Kevin, she did it on purpose. I saw her too late, I admit that. But she stuck her leg under the wheel. I don't know why, but she did. Ted was nearly shouting now. Kevin opened his pad and began writing. He spoke without looking up. If she doesn't press charges, it's moot. Why isn't she sure about it? Ted asked. She says, if you go meet her and make amends, she'll forget the whole thing, Kevin said. Doesn't that sound like a bribe to you? Ted said. I know. I asked right away, Kevin replied. She said she's not looking for a payday, just an apology. Ted closed his eyes and blew air through his nostrils. If you want my advice, Kevin said, just do it and be done with her. She's an oddball. Better to keep your distance. That's exactly what I've been trying to do, Ted said, exasperated. I've been keeping my distance from all of them. She jumped in front of my car. Kevin gave Ted a sideways smile and shrugged. Your call. He turned and started back towards his cruiser. Where do I find her? Ted called after him, to apologize. Kevin didn't turn around. He lifted his arm and pointed toward the meeting hall as he walked. There, Friday night. The patrol car pulled away, leaving Ted standing alone, staring at the sign nailed to the fence. But isn't that where they're filming on Friday? Dave asked. That weird sign seems to suggest it, Ted said. They leaned over opposite sides of the counter in Ted's shop. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, and lazy flurries drifted past the windows. Ted thought about the movie shoot in earnest for the first time. What was the story? Would there be a bubbling cauldron in the middle of the old meeting hall? Would the actors be as strange and menacing in character as they were on the street? Were those even the actors? He didn't really want to find out. So are you going? Dave asked. Ted wore a resigned frown. I don't see what choice I have. She's going to lie about what happened, and it's my word against hers. I don't exactly look like the good guy. She's got a broken leg. And a screw loose, Dave said. Ted didn't respond. He stared out the window, rolling a green ice fishing jig between his finger and thumb. Well, you're not going alone, Dave said. I'll be your consigliere. Ted glanced at him and smiled faintly. He nodded. Thanks. Outside the meeting hall at 8? Wouldn't miss it, Dave said. It was already 8:10, and Ted was more nervous now than when he'd parked the car. He sat half a block away, peering through the windshield. The church had been silent, the grounds still. He wasn't going to learn anything from there. He locked the car and walked tentatively to the gate to wait for Dave. Now it was well past their appointed meeting time, and there was no sign of him. Ted looked up and down the street, irritation rising. He'd spent the day leading up to this warming to the idea of coming. But that was when he imagined himself accompanied by a friend. How could Dave have forgotten? The back of Ted's neck grew hot. He couldn't have known that across town, Dave was dealing with the aftermath of a mysterious fire that had broken out in the stockroom of his pub around 7:30. Dave would be speaking with firefighters and then the police for the next few hours. Ted's legal entanglement with the movie people was far from his mind. Ted pressed his fist softly into the palm of his other hand and chewed his bottom lip. He turned back toward the church. If only he knew something, anything, about what he was walking into. Awkwardness, hostility, even something strange. He could steel himself for all of that. What unsettled him was the not knowing. The building he'd known all his life had taken on an air of grim mystery, and he wanted nothing more than to walk back to his car and leave. In the full dark of the evening, Ted could make out a light in one of the windows. It pulsed faintly, like candlelight. He'd expected professional stage lights, something bright enough to spill onto the street. But the place looked as deserted as ever, save for that soft yellow glow in the far window. The glass was frosted with age and crisscrossed with iron latticework. Even if he crossed the lawn and climbed a tree for a better angle, he knew he'd see nothing. If he left now, he knew he'd have a police officer at his door in the morning. He'd have to go into the station, be officially arrested and processed. He'd be humiliated. His business would be tarnished. Standing at the steps of the church, Ted took a last look back at the gate and streetlights beyond. He took a deep breath and decided that this was the lesser of two evils. The door closed softly behind Ted. He was focused on finding the woman and speaking with her as quickly as possible. But he was also aware that she was here to shoot a movie. He didn't want to ruin a shot, or a take, or whatever they called it. It struck him that he didn't actually know what her role was. Actress? Makeup artist? Producer? The thought evaporated as he took in his surroundings. The entryway, the vestibule, as he'd always known it, had been transformed. The display cases were empty, their glass doors standing open. He wondered if the artifacts had been removed to keep them out of harm's way. But that wasn't all. The room felt larger, more cavernous. Ted turned and realized why. The pulpit was gone. They'd moved it. They'd touched it. Ted felt a flush of anger. All the talk of respecting the town, its history, this sacred place, He could already imagine the historical society in an uproar. The space the pulpit had occupied was garishly vacant, though not entirely empty. Ted made out shapes in the darkness and stepped closer, squinting. Cameras, 2 or 3 of them. They looked abandoned, dusty. He nudged one with his foot. It slid easily across the floor. Ted squatted and lifted the camera. It was hollow. A fake. There were more of them. He touched each in turn. Hard plastic, painted black. He frowned. Why would they need prop cameras to shoot a movie about witches? The rest of the gear looked wrong, too. The lighting rigs had no bulbs. The cables, when he picked one up, were clearly nylon rope, painted black. A dull thud drew his attention to the double doors beside him, the ones that led into the nave, or what had more recently been the meeting hall. Ted stood quickly and stepped away from the fake equipment. Whatever these people were doing, he was certain he was about to see it. As he reached for the iron handle, part of him already knew he would not find a movie set on the other side. The space Ted knew as the Green Falls Meeting Hall was gone. He stepped through the doorway into a forest. It was dark. Moonlight filtering through the windows was enough to make out the trees. Pines, tall and thin, pressed in all around him as he moved forward. Needles brushed his arms and face as he searched for a gap and pushed ahead. "Hello," Ted called out. His voice didn't echo. The trees smothered the sound. He raised his forearm to shield his face and forced his way through the boughs. He looked up, hoping to glimpse the familiar wooden beams of the ceiling, but saw only darkness overhead. Panic tightened in his chest. His breathing grew sharp and uneven. It felt like he'd been walking through the pines for far too long, though he knew the room was no larger than a basketball court. Was he moving in circles? "Who's in here?" he shouted. "What is this?" No one answered. Ted was a grown man, but his nerves were fraying, tears of frustration stinging his eyes. He was moments from dropping to his knees in that impossible forest when he broke through into a clearing. Freed suddenly from the grasping branches, he stumbled and then caught himself. He looked first at the floor and recognized the hard wood beneath his feet. The original planks of the church. A single lantern sat there, its candle muttering as it burned. Ted followed the lantern's light upwards. The pulpit loomed over him. It stood where it once had, dark and gargantuan, rising out of the room as if it had grown there. The narrow wooden stairs wrapped around its side, vanishing upward into the crowding trees. Ted squinted, his eyes tracing the familiar shape, and felt a disorienting lurch of recognition. This was wrong. Something about it was off-kilter. Then he saw a fissure, perhaps 2 inches wide, zigzagged down the body of the pulpit, splitting the carved wood from near the lectern to somewhere below the lantern's reach. It looked as though the structure had been forced open from the inside. Before Ted could make sense of what he was seeing, the branches behind him shifted. He turned and found himself staring into the buttons of a wool vest. The tall man from the street stood inches away, blocking the path he'd come through. For an instant, Ted felt relief. Finally, someone to explain what was happening. That relief vanished when the man shoved him. The blow landed square in Ted's chest, a 2-handed strike that sent him flying backward like a sack of flour. He hit the floor hard and slumped with a groan. When he looked up, the giant stepped into the clearing. 2 smaller figures followed. The first neared the lantern, and Ted recognized the woman from the accident. She wore the same crude smile and walked past him without hesitation. Ted's mouth hung open. She had no crutches, no limp. Days earlier, his stomach had turned at the sight of her glistening tibia on the street. He managed a short, halting sentence before she slipped into the trees beside the pulpit. "What do you want?" She didn't answer. Ted was already looking up. Mrs. Barnes emerged from the darkness. She was entirely nude. Ted flinched and dropped his gaze at once. "Ellen?" he said to the floor. She ignored him. He watched only her feet and ankles as they moved across the pine needles. They passed him and disappeared toward the base of the pulpit. Ted stood, resolved now to get out of the building. The woman could have him arrested, sue him, whatever she wanted. He couldn't stay and be part of whatever was happening here. The thought died when the tall man stepped forward and loomed over him. His broad chest and shoulders filled the gap between the trees, a solid wall. The woman Ted had struck with his car now stood above in the pulpit. She was chanting in a low voice. The words were indistinct. She looked upward, above the tips of the trees, to something Ted couldn't see. A heavy, dragging sound pulled his attention back to the floor. Despite himself, he looked. Mrs. Barnes was hauling a large wooden bucket from out of the trees. She set it down, sat on its rim, and placed her feet inside. The chanting from the pulpit grew louder and more urgent. Ted still couldn't make out any words. He watched the strange woman closely as she made sharp, sudden gestures with her hands. Then the chanting stopped. Her hands froze above her head in an unnatural pose, the heels of her palms pressed together at the wrists. Ted waited for her to move or speak, but she didn't. A sound followed, a soft, wet patter. Dread settled in his chest. Ted lowered his gaze. Below the pulpit, Mrs. Barnes was pressing an object, perhaps a sharp, dark-colored stone, down into the wrinkled flesh of her thigh. Blood ran down her calf into the bucket in slow rivulets. In the dim light, her leg resembled a candle, dripping black wax. "Ellen, don't!" Ted shouted. "Stop!" She looked toward the sound of his voice, and Ted saw her eyes clearly for the first time. They were milky white. It looked as though she'd gone blind in the days since he'd last seen her. Ted lurched forward, arms reaching for Mrs. Barnes. If he could pull the stone from her hand, perhaps whatever hold she was under would break. As he reached the rim of the bucket, the floor dropped away. His stomach pitched. The planks beneath him slid down and back, and suddenly he was rising. For an instant, impossibly, he was weightless. His feet hung free, swinging. "This isn't happening," he thought. "This can't—" Then his back struck something solid. The truth landed all at once. The huge man had him. Great hands closed around his torso, lifting him as easily as a child's doll. Ted kicked uselessly as he was carried away from Mrs. Barnes and back toward the trees. The giant hurled him to the floor. Ted scrambled onto his knees and lunged for the cover of the branches. His head brushed the low-hanging boughs before a hand seized his ankle and dragged him back. His face scraped along the uneven planks, and he roared in pain. The grip released his ankle, only to return with crushing force. A massive hand pressed into his back in midsection. Another caught the collar of his shirt and yanked hard. Fabric tore. Without warning, a searing pain flared across his back near the shoulder, white-hot and blinding. Ted screamed like a wounded animal. After a moment, the intensity subsided. He wondered if he'd been burned with an iron. The giant flipped him over, and Ted propped himself up on his elbows. The man leapt behind him with a swiftness a man of his size shouldn't have been capable of. Almost instantly, an arm wrapped around Ted's neck. His head jutted awkwardly above the crook of the huge elbow. The pressure increased. Ted couldn't breathe. His wife's face flashed in his mind. If his throat could move air, he might have said something to her. The arm constricted until his vision dimmed. He scratched at the man's arm and face to no effect. As darkness dropped, the last thing Ted saw was Mrs. Barnes, still hunched over the bucket, the black stone disappearing into her flesh. I'm telling you, Dave, it's like a tattoo. They put a tattoo on me, Ted said across the empty dining room of the pub. He was stacking chairs upside down on tabletops so Dave could vacuum. The restaurant had closed half an hour earlier, and Ted had waited for a moment when they were finally alone. I'm just so sorry I wasn't there, Dave said quietly. No, Ted said, you're not. It was a living nightmare. I don't know how many of them it took to turn that place into a forest, but they did it. I assure you, you don't wish you'd been in there. And the next day, poof, they're gone. Trucks, trees, gear, weirdos, all in the wind, Dave said. And me, Ted went on, propped against the door of my shop. Kevin, the cop, found me. I might have died of exposure. He glanced out the window toward the falls, lit green-red for the holidays. They stood in silence for a moment before Dave spoke again. And Ellen Barnes? Ted shook his head. I told Kevin and the deputies everything. Told them they had to get her out of there. Bring an ambulance. By the time Kevin got me home, they'd radioed to say Mrs. Barnes was back in her house, safe and sound, furious to be woken at that hour. I heard it all over the cruiser's radio. It doesn't sound like Kevin arrested you, Dave said. You expect to hear about that car accident again? No, Ted said. I don't. Even if they hadn't all disappeared after whatever they were doing in the old church. She doesn't have much of a case anymore. Not after her miraculous recovery. Dave shook his head, marveling. The damnedest thing, he said. After a moment, he shot Ted a look. So, can I see it? Ted was already unbuttoning his shirt. I thought you'd never ask, he said, lifting the fabric. Dave held the shirt aside and leaned in. The mark on Ted's shoulder was a single line, perfectly straight, no wider than a toothpick. I can see what you mean, Dave said. It's gray-blue, like an old-fashioned tattoo. Just one line, Ted said, tugging his shirt back into place. What do you think it means? Dave frowned. Looks like a tally mark, he said, like they're taking a count. He started to laugh, then stopped. So, Ted said quietly, I'm just the first? The first of what? Dave asked.
Thanks for listening to tonight's Terror. If you enjoyed the story, follow, rate, and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps new listeners find the show. Visit tonightsterror.com for all our stories, merch, and more. Until next time, sleep well.